You're on CYInterview.
I'm Chris Shandek. Featured columnist Jay Bilstein is with me today on CYInterview. We welcome back President and Chief Executive Officer of the Meharry Medical College, Dr. James Hildreth. He is an immunologist with an extraordinary educational background, which includes Harvard, Oxford, and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. This week, the university received a $34 million gift from former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's organization, Bloomberg Philanthropies. Dr. Hildreth, thank you for joining us again on CYInterview. How are you?
I'm very well, and thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
We always enjoy having you on, Dr. Hildreth, very much. So just to begin, general question, how much is this money going to help Meharry Medical School, and in an overview, general overview, in what ways?
So the gift from Bloomberg Philanthropies is specifically to allow us to reduce the debt of our currently enrolled medical students. It's a significant problem really across the country, but students who attend our schools, the four black medical schools, tend to come from households with incomes of less than $75,000 compared to majority of students who go to the other schools. Typically, they have come from household incomes of $175,000. So there's a huge gap in the amount of support families can provide. Therefore, there's a huge gap in the amount of money that has to be borrowed. To give you an example, it would not be unusual for a medical student at Meharry to graduate owing $290,000 when they start their residency. So this $100,000 from Bloomberg Philanthropies for each of those students will reduce their debt substantially. And I'm excited because it will allow the students to have agency in terms of the decisions they make. And what I mean by that is the more debt you have, the more likely you are to choose something other than a primary care specialty, because primary care doctors get paid at the lowest end of the compensation scale. So this will allow students to continue to make the choice, which many of our students want to make, to be a primary care doctor and to work in the underserved areas of the country. So it's a really extraordinarily impactful gift for our students.
Well, I was gonna ask you about a little bit of what you were just talking about. So with the ability to ease some of those financial burdens for the students because of this money, this will give them an opportunity, I guess you believe, to be able to choose what they really want to do instead of just looking for the highest paid medical job possible after their education is done. So can you just further elaborate on how important that really is?
Well, as the country continues to grow and as the demographics change to an older and browner, I guess, population, the need for diverse healthcare providers is really important, but it's really also important that not only do we grow the numbers of providers, we need some of them or a lot of them to focus on primary care, because that's where we can have the most impact on reducing the cost of healthcare, but also making the nation healthier by doing that. So the four institutions in question, Morehouse, Meharry, Drew, and Howard, a large proportion of our students choose primary care. And so I think that's another reason that Bloomberg Philanthropies thought it would be a good idea to invest in our institutions. So I think it's the evolving demographics of the country, the urgent need for primary care physicians is one of the reasons why we think this is a great investment to make.
Personally speaking, what does this mean to you to be able to give these students an easier road once they finish their schooling?
Well, I'm excited for them to be able to sort of live the dream they had. Many of the students come to us aspiring to be primary care doctors, to go back to communities that really need them. But quite honestly, if you choose that and you know your compensation will not be enough to start a family or to have the kind of lifestyle you want, it makes it a challenging choice. So again, this allows the students to really continue to live that dream of going back and doing those things. But the other thing I think is very important is a gift of this size from Bloomberg Philanthropies kind of sends a signal about what kind of organization we are, that we're worth investing in. I mean, that's a lot of money, $100 million to the 4 institutions. And it also just sends a signal that we are we are credible, we are strong, we do a great job of training physicians. So I think the gift itself says a lot about who we are and how we do what we do. So I think that's important as well.
Good morning, Dr. Hildreth. An absolute pleasure to have you back with us.
Oh, yes, hi.
I feel like one thing might be lacking here, and that is you don't seem like the type of person to want to take a bow, but I must ask you, don't you believe that one of the reasons why the college, your medical school, got this money is because you have been out there in a very eloquent fashion making a case during COVID and the need, particularly in certain segments of the population, for us to do a far better job of serving the American people, of all American people, and don't you believe that because you did this, it brought Meharry to the forefront?
Well, I guess in some ways, I just think that I'm doing what I should be doing. I mean, I'm infectious disease expert. I think I do a good job of explaining the science to make it accessible to people. So I do think that my advocacy and me being out front, talking about COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 and all this, that it's had an impact. But I also have to remind myself that Meharry has been around for 144 years. We survived another pandemic. We survived the Flexner Report. We survived the Great Depression. So, there are good bones and good genes in that organization. I think that this is just me doing what I think I should be doing. And so I'm not inclined to take any bows. I just think, this is what I should be doing, so I'm trying to do it. But let me just say what I said to my board, which is I think it's so appropriate that the largest gift ever from Meharry was focused on our students, because I really believe our students are amazing. They have great hearts, great spirits of service, and I'm so happy for them.
Well, I believe that Michael Bloomberg is a great human being and a wonderful philanthropist, and I feel that you were a brilliant doctor and a humanitarian and a person who, I don't know what it is. It seems that people who really have talent and who work hard and dedicated are also some of the most humble people around, which is sometimes a little bit troubling in a nation where we seem to be imbrued with people who would claim to be leaders who I think are virtually empty vessels, but certainly go on and on about their own self-believed greatness. So I know you're not willing to take a bow, but I think that you should receive a great number of the kudos for being able to bring Meharry more into media prominence, and I hope the gift from the Bloomberg Foundation is but the beginning of things. Dr. Hildreth, are you familiar? I think it was last year, perhaps the year before, I believe NYU had announced, I don't know how long this is going to go on for, that medical students won't have to pay tuition. What would it take for Meharry to get to that point?
We would need an endowment of probably a few $100 million to achieve that, and that's what they did for NYU. I believe it was the founder of Home Depot and some of his colleagues who raised the money necessary. And one of the ironies of it is one of their stated goals was to give those students the agency I spoke about, that by not having the burden of debt from tuition and the cost of attending medical school, that some of the NYU graduates would choose primary care and go where they're most needed. And I was saying to some of my colleagues that if they really wanted to achieve that, they should have come to Meharry Medical College, because for 144 years, our students have been doing that, despite the debt. So we would have to have an endowment of about the size of the one that NYU got to do that. And one of our fundraising goals, honestly, and it's an ambitious goal, but we'd like to one day achieve that target, because we have a track record of attracting students who, when they leave us, they go out and do and serve where they're most needed. So, and maybe that was part of the inspiration for Bloomberg Philanthropies and doing what they did. I don't know, but they're probably related.
Well, I think you were referring, Dr. Hildreth, to Ken Langone, who was responsible at NYU, and I would say certainly here at CYInterview you have a permanent open door to be able to come on and act as a Goodwill Ambassador, not simply a Goodwill Ambassador for Meharry, but also for strong medical wisdom in terms of being able, as a society, to bring the type of medical care to all segments of society, and not simply have areas we talked about in the past about food deserts. We also have medical deserts. I've never heard the term medical desert. Maybe it exists, but we have medical deserts. And it is beyond the pale that exists in 2020 in the United States of America, and I believe you were at the forefront of changing that. Working off some very, very good news, would it be okay if for our listenership we kind of jumped into some COVID-related matters?
No problem.
Okay, because, some of this stuff makes my eyes roll when I read the abstracts and reports, and I know you're going to be able to make sense of this. There was, I guess it was at I don't remember the whole long name, the National Labs in Tennessee. A paper came out recently. It was called A Mechanistic Model and Therapeutic Interventions for COVID-19 Involving an RAS-Mediated Bradykinin Storm. That's a mouthful for me. Supposedly used some very powerful computing to be able to come to certain conclusions. And what this was really looking for, in my understanding, is what are some convalescent therapies that might be used. This wasn't looking at, hey, what kind of vaccine might we come up with, but how might we be able to treat people who have contracted COVID-19. And one of the things that popped out to me as a layperson is that there was a suggestion that perhaps COVID shouldn't be looked at as simply some kind of respiratory virus with these tremendous receptors for the virus in the nose, which I'm going to come back to, but should be looked at as a vascular disease because I believe in the article it said that this disease causes hyperpermeability of the vascular system, meaning leaking blood vessels. I wonder if you could speak to this and what that just means in general, and then we'll go a little bit further.
So I haven't read the report that you allude to, but it is true that a number of people who have studied the virus and its pathophysiology closely have concluded that maybe this is a disease more of the vascular system than it is the respiratory system. And that relates to something else you alluded to, which is that the receptor for this virus is widely distributed in the body, which means that the virus has access to multiple organ systems. I'm still struck by the fact that so many people in their 40s and 50s, they first present with strokes because of the effect that the virus has had on their arteries, on their circulatory system. And the other thing that your audience should understand, viruses can cause disease in two ways. There's the actual destruction of cells and tissues when the virus replicates in those tissues. But sometimes the immune response to the virus can do harm as well. And that's where the bradykinins and the cytokines come in. That when those chemicals are released, and they bind to receptors on cells, those cells can then release enzymes, proteases, glycosidases, and other things that do enormous damage. It's part of protecting the body when it's done and controlled well, but when it's uncontrolled, as in COVID-19, the results can be multi-organ disease, like we see. And I think what some of the people have been trying to do is to figure out which cytokines or which bradykinin or which of those chemical signals are causing the most harm, and then direct our treatments to those very important and critical players in all of this. So that's what I think that's what they're alluding to.
Well, wow, and you're ahead of me as usual, because I remember when the whole pandemic started, I said, well, often in life past is prologue. I mean, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but I once saw somebody write, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So I started doing some reading, going back 100 years ago to the influenza in 1918, and it said exactly what you were stating, that, you know, there was a belief that a lot of the damage done 100 years ago by that virus was not simply the virus itself, but the body's reaction. I believe it talked about a cytokine storm.
Oh, yes.
And now, I guess, is it pronounced bradykine storm or bradykinin storm, is what is being looked at now, which is the body's response. And it also makes me think about, for example, I know you mentioned you're an athlete. You played basketball in college, did you not, if my memory serves? I know you had... Briefly. But I know you mentioned that. And the thing is, so any of us who've ever played ball and been involved in athletics, we get a sprain. What do? We put ice on something to lower the inflammation. And, of course, that inflammation, if I'm correct, comes from the body's response to the insult to it. Yes. So a lot of what's being looked at then, if I understand from your explanation, is how we can kind of control the body's response to COVID, not simply COVID itself.
Exactly. And that might explain why some people do okay with COVID-19, or relatively okay, because their immune response is much more controlled and regulated than persons who don't do so well, because the immune system is so exuberant and trying to eliminate the virus.
And isn't this also one of the challenges in autoimmune diseases, which is the body is attacking itself with defenses that are built to protect the body? To wit, one of the things they mentioned in this paper, and I know you haven't read it, but I'm sure you're familiar with some of the general concepts, there has been, at least in this paper and some other places I've seen, renewed interest in the role of vitamin D and its ability to protect people specifically from so-called respiratory viruses. Is there emerging thought that amping up vitamin D in the general public might be something that helps people deal with the insult of COVID better, or perhaps even arms them better not to get it if they do come in contact with it?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's overlap. It may be coincidental, but there is an overlap between those most likely to get severe disease, or more than modest disease, and those who have vitamin D deficiency. And it's really interesting that vitamin D plays a critical role in regulating a pathway that involves the receptor for COVID-19, for the virus, SARS-CoV-2. But there are certain parts of our immune response that are impaired if vitamin D levels are low. And so when I was on in my tweet the other day, I actually mentioned this, that people who have vitamin D deficiency, who are in high-risk category, should probably think about supplementing their vitamin D, just to make sure, absolutely sure, that is not one of the reasons that they will get disease. So that, I think the evidence is getting stronger and stronger that vitamin D deficiency might put people at a greater risk of severe disease than not, because the response to the virus would be less than it could be.
And to dig into vitamin D a little, it's got to be vitamin D3, vitamin D2 to have the desired effect if this is a vitamin that's being taken by mouth. Is that correct?
That's correct, because then you'll get the necessary breakdown and metabolites form that'll have the activity that you're looking for. Yes.
You know, there are so many vexing things, again, as a layperson. For example, when it comes to the role of sun in vitamin D production, I also read, hey, the best way you can build up your vitamin D is, you know, noonday sun, maybe for up to half an hour, et cetera, and you have to get exposed on your chest or your back and so forth. Arms is not enough. And on the other hand, you have dermatologists saying, hey, you go out in the sun, spend a lot of time in the sun, all of a sudden you could be inviting potential for melanoma the more time you're out in the sun, skin cancer, and so forth. One thing I was thinking when reading this, because of the content of melanin in the skin of people who are of color, is it possible that because it takes more sun for somebody who has darker skin than somebody who has lighter skin, it leaves them with less production of vitamin D and consequently makes those folks more susceptible to a virus of this nature? Or is that far off? Is that far-fetched?
No, it's not. And that's why, for me personally, I've been taking a multivitamin for the last, 4 years every day to make sure. I mean, I eat a healthy diet. You know, I spend a lot of time outside in the garden, messing around. So I think that I would get sufficient vitamin D from being outside as much as I am. But knowing what you just said is the case. I take a multivitamin that includes vitamin D. So, and I think these things may not seem important separately, but all together, it just points to the fact that there are certain things we can do in our daily routines to keep our immune system more fit than they otherwise would be. And to me, that's just a simple thing to do. Absent a really healthy diet, maybe vitamin supplements or something we should all think about.
Understandable. Please allow me, Doctor, one more technical question. This is really fascinating stuff for our listeners, I'm sure. One more of these vexing points. One of the things that was brought up in this specific paper, I'm talking about this paper because it's kind of what I've seen as the latest. They talked about using a medication, I think it was called not statin, but it was called timbetacin, which is supposed to increase something called fibrinolysis, which I guess fibrinolysis is decreasing fibrin in the body, and I guess fibrin is a clotting factor of some kind. Here's what I don't understand. If a virus creates hyperpermeability, if a virus creates leaky blood vessels, how would the same virus create blood clots? It seems to be doing two things that are completely contradictory, right? I mean, leakiness, to me, when I think of leakiness, I think of, well, the blood's not clotting well enough. But on the other hand, you've got these people with these strokes, and you got people who are getting too much clotting with COVID. And I kind of sat reading the paper, and I said, which is it? Is it making the blood vessels leak, or is it blocking up the blood vessels? And it seems like it does both. Is that what we're dealing with here?
So let's walk through this. So you've got blood vessels of various sizes. There's the major vessels like the aorta and the vena cava, which is equivalent for the blood going back to the heart. Then you got medium-sized vessels, then you got small vessels that finally break down into capillaries. So if the vessels are leaky and fluid leaks out, that means the density of the cells or the form components in the blood goes up, right? In other words, with less fluid in the blood vessels, the cells, platelets, and red blood cells are going to become much more dense and a higher density in terms of volume. And that promotes clotting because it slows down the flow of blood. You got all these cells in such a small space. So that's why leaky vessels and clotting are not necessarily opposite things. In fact, they're connected because of the way it all works.
Okay. So, now, because when I read it, I said, it seems like opposing factors. But what you're saying, no, in fact, the leaking blood vessels leads to the clotting. And
they're leaking fluid, not the formed components of the blood.
Understood. So do you believe from your vast experience that irrespective of a vaccine that in a number of more months we'll have some significant convalescent therapies that lessen the burden on people who do contract COVID-19?
I really do think so, and I also think that there's so many exciting drug candidates, therapeutic candidates that are being evaluated that probably by the spring of next year there'll be a few of those that have shown some great potential. The vaccine, I believe, I don't think there'll be one by November. I mean, I don't know how that could be possible, but maybe I'm wrong. But I do think that by next spring, early summer, there might be one, possibly 3 vaccines that have shown sufficient safety and efficacy to begin widespread distribution. I'm going to be delighted if it's sooner than that, but I think that's a realistic timeline. But, the audience needs to understand that hundreds of scientists around the world who are working on other things really put those other projects on pause to focus on COVID-19. And because there are so many scientists asking so many questions in so many different ways, I just believe that some really good things and exciting things are going to fall out of that. And so I'm feeling pretty good about where we are and the prospects for, in a year from now, being able to have a different conversation.
Dr. Hildreth, has this been the greatest medical mobilization in the history of the world?
Well, in my career, which kind of started in, I guess, the late 70s when I started doing research as a graduate student, I've never seen anything like it, and my colleagues all, I think, would say the same. Even some of my mentors who are still alive, who are in their 80s, some in their 90s, they would say that this has been quite remarkable, that the level of global mobilization of biomedical researchers focused on a single problem, there's never been anything quite like it. And the other thing people should know, I think I mentioned this before, the technological tools available now to do this kind of research are just mind-blowing for me. And I think I may have given you this example. When the Chinese scientists posted the complete genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, less than a month later, at least 3 companies had already identified a vaccine candidate by using in silico modeling of the proteins. And again, these proteins were not expressed in real time. They were simply expressed in silico using the powerful supercomputing tools we have. And that's just truly amazing to me. It really is. Because that used to take at least a year to do the work necessary to identify a candidate for a vaccine, and now it can be done in less than a month. So,
I think one of the things that I find most heartening besides the technological innovation is that, at least in the United States, the medical community has seemed in large part to have pulled together for the benefit of the people in the country and the world, without the benefit of us having sober political leadership. And I think that goes to show that we can't simply sit on our hands waiting for someone in a national capital or in a state capital to do something. It is we, the people, and those people like yourself with subject matter mastery, to come together and work to do what's in everyone's best interests. And God willing, and I say God willing, one day we will have more sober, serious, somber, directed, and focused leadership, but at least the medical community hasn't sat on its hands waiting for that direction. It's taken the bull by the horns. And
no, you're right, and thank goodness for that.
Thank goodness for that, indeed, and thank God for you, and you're really doing unbelievable work, Dr. Hildreth, and like I said, you have a permanent open door here on CYInterview, and anything we can do to help you get the word out, we absolutely want to, and we wish the students at Meharry well, and this is really, really incredible and terrific stuff.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy these conversations.
All right.
Chris?
So for President of the Meharry Medical College, Dr. James Hildreth, featured columnist Jay Bilstein, and CY Interview, I'm Christian.